Hello and welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. I have on tonight an esteemed guest and friend of mine, Aaron Adair, and we have just written a book in case you didn't know. So not that this is going to be about that at all, but check it out. It's an awesome, shiny book
You
with a
don't want
lovely
that
cover.
book. You want this book.
Oh, no, I'll tell you what, just get both.
There,
Aliens
there.
Aliens and religion, where two worlds collide. We're not going to talk about that tonight, but I
Maybe a
will.
tiny bit. Maybe a tiny
Oh,
bit.
interesting. What we are
Because
going to. Oh,
it does kind of intersect with, because one of the things that our topic is about people potentially misinterpreting old, events and then exaggerating them into gods, basically. That's kind of the premise of Ancient Aliens, which we partially debunk in our book.
yeah, there you go. Well, I'm quite excited about this because Aaron is going to r- be driving this talk. He's written something on this before. I'm sure he'll talk about that. But before I guess we get into the topic of Euhemerism, let's just give you a basic Wikipedia definition of what it is. It is an approach to the interpretation of mythology in which mythological accounts are presumed to have originated from real historical events or personages. Euhemerism supposes that historical accounts become myths as they are exaggerated in the retelling, accumulating elaborations and alterations that reflect cultural mores. It was named for the Greek mythographer Euhemerus, who lived in the late 4th century BC. In more recent literature of myth, such as Bulfinch's mythology, Euhemerism is termed as historical theory of mythology. I'm sure that Aaron will tell us about Euhemerus as well. I'm pretty sure it's on the cards. Just to let you know, in a true vein of a tippling philosopher, cheers.
Cheers.
And so, let us talk about how real humans can get mythologized into divine proportions. And this I thought about this recently. Just to, I'll let you speak much more fluidly and coherently than I am at the moment in a minute. But I was watching an interview with Derek Lambert and Josh Bowen and Kip Davis, all people who I've had on the show, and Derek Lambert said there could be this idea of Euhemerism, whereby Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible was originally actually a person and maybe some great warrior who became mythologized. And I never thought of that, and I had this light bulb moment, and then only later realized that Euhemerism is exactly what I believe of Jesus, say in the resurrection, that this was just a normal human who was crucified, a historical character who then becomes mythologized into being a deity. So if I believe that about Jesus, then actually what's to say that Yahweh wasn't the same sort of character? Anyway, give us an introduction, Aaron. Tell us about what well, you can introduce people to who you are if they don't know you, but of course they should.
They
And
better.
lead us into Euhemerism.
Yeah, so I mean, as the Wikipedia article says, that this is a theory of mythology. They, tie it to a particular person's name, but the original writing of Euhemerus is lost to us. We have uh, paraphrases, we have very loose translations of parts of it, so we can kind of, to some degree, reconstruct what the original story was, but we don't have the original thing, and so we also are very uncertain about what was Euhemerus's point in creating this story that he wrote down, which was called it's either translated as the Sacred History or the Sacred Inscription. There's a little bit of philological argument about what's the best translation, but the idea that Euhemerus had in his story, and I'm going to say story because there are features of it that seem to be fictional on purpose. But the story is that basically Euhemerus is going off on this fact-finding mission, and he takes a ship all the way out to this island out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And as you could probably guess, that's a really hard thing to do for a civilization that's mostly focused on the Mediterranean Sea.
Mm.
So that's already a bit weird. This island that no one has ever heard of before or ever found, and later writers say it's completely made up, called Pankira. They go there, and there are these people that have this old form of worship, and right like in the center of the island, there is this giant column, and written on there is the deeds of Zeus. written by Zeus himself. This was an inscription that Zeus himself commissioned, and then you find out that Zeus was a dude. His father was Kronos, whose grandfather was Uranus, and they called the sky Uranus because Uranus was the first person to look up at the sky and start worshiping the heavenly bodies, and basically started religion. Um, Zeus himself, he's born in Crete, but he goes on all sorts of adventures. He basically spreads civilization and laws and things like that. Because, without Zeus going around telling people what to do, everyone is like, well, let's just murder and eat each other. Like, we don't understand that cannibalism is a bad idea unless somebody tells us these common stories back then.
So let me get this right in the understanding of what Euhemeris is doing here. Is this an etiological story? So an etiological story, etiology is the method of creating stories to explain places, people. So, for example, there's a salt rock near in somewhere in the Middle East where that the story then of Lot's wife, getting turned into a pillar of salt, then is a kind of explanation of that rock. In the same way that here we've got Euhemeris saying, well, we've got the gods, how can I explain how the gods came to be? And even though it's fiction, it's the kind of a pseudo history
Yeah.
of the Greek gods. Interesting. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. Yeah, the story is also supposed to end that Zeus finally returns to Crete, where he is eventually buried, and you can go and visit the tomb of Zeus.
Right.
The interesting thing is that one of the first responses we have to this story, we actually have this much better preserved by a guy by the name of Callimachus, and he basically just straight up says, Euhemeris, he doesn't use the exact name, but he basically just says, complete liar. These Cretans, they're liars. In fact, the phrase, all Cretans are liars, goes to Callimachus.
Right.
And if you're wondering, that also becomes an interesting issue because Callimachus himself was a Cretan. Which, if you say all Cretans are liars and he's a Cretan, that leads
it's
to
a classic paradox. Yeah.
Which is in the Bible, by the way. It's in, I forget if it's Second Timothy or Titus. It's one of the pastoral epistles, but he basically says, and he is right. So basically, that logical conundrum is right there in the New Testament.
Interesting.
Yeah, so basically saying, this is absolute poppycock, to use a little bit more modern terminology, but just saying, this is completely false. Zeus, he is immortal, he is eternal, he is not dead, rotting in a tomb. And yet, we can tell that this idea really caught on. We actually read in later writers that people were literally visiting the alleged tomb as a pilgrimage site for centuries later. It even comes up in the arguments of some of the early Christians and anti-Christians. So Celsus, who we only have in quotations from Origen.
There is a shame that it would be wonderful to have Celsus's writing. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a little bit of interesting back and forth in there where Celsus is basically, doing various attacks on the Christians, and the tomb of Zeus actually comes up. And according to Celsus, the Cretans don't really believe this is actually the tomb of Zeus, that they have some sort of esoteric interpretation, some other, esoteric myth that goes behind that. Well, Origen basically says, no, you're just a liar. This is what's really the case is, Zeus was just a dude, and you guys are just trying to make up things after the fact. So it's kind of interesting that the only response to this story was to call everyone else liars, even though the first person who created the story was called a liar.
And of course, that's special pleading, because that's exactly what you would say about Jesus, where Origen wouldn't be believing that. It would be saying, well, no, he definitely was a divine figure. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and Zeus wasn't the only god to allegedly have a tomb. Multiple tomb sites around Crete were said to be the tomb of Zeus. There's also tombs of Apollo, tombs of Dionysus, tombs of many of the other gods that had more or less popularity, or at least they're alleged in the extant literature that we have. And like I say, at least some of them were literally sites of worship. So it wasn't just some highfalutin idea from just one crazy person in the past, but it was apparently a relatively popular kind of literature at the time. And just to show how popular it is and how they try to give it some sense of antiquity, there is this kind of literature that we don't have it preserved, we just know it exists because other people mention it. It's called the Phrygian literature. And I don't know how much you know about Phrygia, the old country.
No, enlighten me.
Yeah, so Phrygia, it's basically in modern day Turkey, and the thing that makes it interesting and why would we want to associate literature with Phrygia is that there was this argument between the Egyptians and the Phrygians, allegedly, of who had the most ancient culture of all. Whereas it the Egyptians or the Phrygians? And in Herodotus, there's this story of where the Egyptian pharaoh comes up with an experiment, like the not quite double blind, but like the first like experiment to try to figure out what is the oldest language, and then from that figure out which civilization is closest to that, and then say that's the oldest civilization. And it's the sort of experiment that would we call anywhere between highly unethical and holy shit, why would you ever think that's a good idea? But the idea was, okay, the most original language has to be before anyone else was speaking. So they think, okay, we're going to take two twins, or just one set of twins, and basically immediately take them from their mother and have them grow up in a hut in the middle of nowhere so they have no interactions with any other people speaking. The only interaction they'll even have with the human is when a goat herd comes to give them milk, so they're not like, dying. But other than that, the goat herd is supposed to come, not say a single word, and the idea is, all right, let's see what language these infants develop on their own. And so this goes on for months. The goat herd comes in, gives them milk, but doesn't say a word, doing the very basic maintenance of taking care of the kids and then leaving. And then, so the story goes, one day the goat herd is coming back. The bell on the goat is ringing about, and so the kids are, now finally able to like start walking out, and they come out and they say the first word that the goat herd hears. Now, when I first got to read the story, this was in my Greek class, and while my Greek was not perfect, I had the perfect brain for understanding what was being said here, while my other classmates were like, well, what's going on here? Because it says, and the word that these kids were saying in Greek was bekos. Beta, epsilon, kappa, omicron, sigma. Bekos. And my other classmates are like, well, what does this word mean? There's not anywhere like in our dictionary or anything. But my brain is well poised for puns. It's not Bekos.
Oh God, yeah. Tell me
It's
about it, mate.
Bekos.
Right.
So it's like they're imitating the sound of the goat. It's like,
Yeah.
but then allegedly, hey, this also looks very similar to the Phrygian word for bread, and so this was how they determined the Phrygians had the oldest culture, or so Herodotus tells us. So
Yeah.
this idea in antiquity was the Phrygians had the oldest literature. So by saying this literature is Phrygian literature, you're saying it's extremely antique, and this was stories of the gods as people going around and having adventures. These were very popular stories in the Hellenistic and Greco-Roman period.
Right. And so moving on towards, I guess. Well, you take us on from there. How we get towards this? Other examples possibly of Euhemerism in ancient antiquity. I mean, you said
Yeah.
that. Interestingly, I'm going on holiday to Crete this summer.
Hmm.
That's our annual holiday, and I'm looking forward to maybe is it Tomb is you still in existence? That tomb.
I don't think so, but like the cave where Zeus was supposed to have been born, that is a place you can go and visit. Though there are multiple sites of
Yeah.
where allegedly he was born. So like just at the foot of Mount Ida or closer to the ancient Mycenaean capital of Knossos, things like that.
Yeah.
I think there's at least places you can visit, and so you could try to get a little bit more in touch with these ancient stories. But as far as I know, the actual tomb is not obviously present. And there's even stories about how that site was chosen. That originally, like, there was inscription above it, but some of the letters faded away, and so people were misreading it. And these are all things that come like centuries later. So you just realize, well, one person made things up, and other people are just, continuing to make up how these things come up. It's just a whole lot of fiction writing. And this was actually fairly common, like explaining how and why Homer was blind and things like that, and alleging things based on people's names, or like, Euripides wrote all these tragedy plays. Oh, what terrible things must have happened in his life. And so making up these stories of what terrible tragedies must have happened to him so he could write all these other tragedies. But you realize it's all fiction.
So, I mean, these are examples of where people have fictionally been trying to explain a kind of, as I said, a pseudo historical basis for some of these people like Zeus. Is there any? Do you have any knowledge of in antiquity, particularly, I don't know, maybe Greek antiquity, of actual historical characters being, deified?
Oh, absolutely. So, in many ways, people wonder if when Euhemerus made his story, was this actually a way to either promote or denigrate the efforts of kings deifying themselves, and in particular, after the time of Alexander the Great, people or certain Greek generals were doing more to try to basically create cults to themselves, maybe slightly inspired by what the Egyptian pharaohs had been doing. So it's an open question if Euhemerus was trying to show that this whole idea was silly, or if he's trying to create the grounds for that. And to give a little bit of reason why that might be,
Mm.
is a later user of Euhemerus is this Latin author by the name of Aeneas, who is also was the first person to basically roughly translate Euhemerus's work into Latin. In fact, it was one of the first Greek writings to be translated into Latin, so that's how popular it was. And it looks like the reason Aeneas was doing this was that way he could basically move for the reason to deify the recently super victorious great general Scipio Africanus, the person who basically beat Hannibal. And
Right.
so he basically takes the story of Euhemerus, where Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite are all originally humans. They do something or create a cult to themselves that makes them immortalized in this sort of way. Basically showing, hey, these people they did great things in their life and they were worshipped in their lifetime or soon after. And we should be doing the same thing for our absolutely great general who basically saved Rome. He's almost like a second founder of Rome, so we should be treating him with, at least as much reverence as they did Romulus. So that's a historical case with one Roman general, and then for the longest time, most Roman emperors, unless they were terrible, would also be deified after their deaths, or even before that. I've read some
Did,
really
did,
mixed things. Yeah,
did
go
people
ahead.
actually genuinely believe that, though? I mean, maybe it's an impossible question to answer, but you wonder when you hear about the deification of Roman emperors, whether actually people around that time genuinely thought that these people really were divine, or whether it was just a kind of accepted fiction, just part of the aggrandizement of really important people. I don't know.
So I bet some people did. For example, I was going to mention Augustus, or Octavius, and there's kind of a weird mixture of things. Some of the um, materials that the court produced, especially after he died, was basically trying to show him becoming a god after he died. And of course, he had coinage that's already said he was a son of a god because he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who had already
Yeah.
been deified. And
Phileas, yeah, the
yeah,
son of God,
ex-
yeah. Which is
yeah,
where we, and sorry to derail this, but as I talk about in my book, The Nativity of Critical Examination, this is where you get ideas of, uh, you know, Jesus needing to be better than Caesar Augustus because he's a contemporary kind of competitor, and so whatever Caesar Augustus's birth story was and death story was, like Jesus has to be one better than that. And so
mhm,
Caesar Augustus is called Divi Filius, so son of God. So here you had son of God as well, and there are all these parallels. But yeah,
yeah, yeah. So like some of the stuff that especially happened like at Augustus's funeral is trying to suggest that he's being taken up to heaven as a deity. But on the other hand, there is some literature from his court while he was alive that was already calling him a god, like living, breathing God on earth, not going to become a god, but literally was one right now. And there was an inscription in Egypt, and it dates to 7 BCE, and it also says that Caesar Augustus is a star from heaven living on earth right now. And so that's just like some devotee scribing that into the rock. So it seems like some people were believing that even outside of the people that are just constantly trying to, um, you know, praise themselves in front of Augustus, to get benefits very quickly.
so do you think so those are, we see a lot of deification of historical figures in terms of leaders of countries like Roman emperors and generals, as you say. Do we have any evidence that any of the pantheon of Greek gods, the kind of orthodox pantheon, if you like, were originally real people? And Romulus and Remus, I wonder.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the original pantheon because uh, to me, I think I've dug up some interesting stuff about Romulus, but when it comes to the Greek gods, we can actually find the names of them in pre-classical literature. So in the Linear B writings from Crete, so this would be like anywhere between like 2000 and 1000 BCE, which is before Homer and all them. You find like the names of Poseidon and Zeus and others. Who you don't find is Aphrodite, because she's actually an import later into the Greek pantheon. Because originally she basically descends from Inanna to Ishtar to so on until she comes to Cyprus,
Right.
where she's then makes her own trip to Sparta, where originally she's also like Inanna and Ishtar, not just a goddess of love and beauty, but also of war. So, like the Spartan
Right.
version of Athena or of Aphrodite also has weapons. She only finally gets nerfed in the works of Homer, where she's completely incompetent on the battlefield.
Right.
But nonetheless, we find like very ancient writings already showing Poseidon, Zeus, and others already were gods. And the word Zeus itself, it looks like it's actually from an Indo-European root that goes back really far. That basically just means like brightness or deity and things like that. So if Zeus is based on a person, it would have to go into Proto-Indo-European times, which is
Right.
beyond
Wow.
any historical evidence.
Right. Interesting. And well, you said it might be something interesting on Romulus and Remus, what looked like mythical figures who created Rome.
Yeah. Now the thing is, the earliest story about Romulus and Remus does not come from Latin sources. It comes from Greeks. And the Greeks had a habit of coming up with stories for how towns got their names from their founding figures. So this looks like a Greek innovation to say, well, your city name is Roma, then it must have been written by some Romulus guy.
Right.
And it also, best I can tell, it might be that the oldest versions is that Romulus was, again, a dude and not a god, but eventually he gets turned into a god, and actually he gets, not synthesized, but syncretized with another Roman deity by the name of Quirinus, who was some sort of god of some importance to not specifically the Romans, but nearby the Sabaeans. Yeah, the Romans, or when I say the Romans or the Latins, like you are only talking like one very small portion of modern day Rome. Then you got the various neighbors who didn't get along for a long time, and then when like Rome actually became a power was when those territories at least united enough to not like keep punching each other and have a little bit more central control of the Italian peninsula, and then eventually all of Italy. But even there, the relationships were rocky, even into like the imperial period. That sometimes old rifts were remembered in the same sort of way, like how Sicilians will sometimes see themselves a little bit differently than the rest of Italians. That kind of old history. Like Italy itself was not a country until like the 19th century. So
Yeah.
there's kind of that weird old history. But nonetheless, it looks like calling Rome, as founded by Romulus and gave his name to that, was probably a Greek invention, and then Romulus getting united with other Latin gods, and eventually even going beyond that, where Romulus wasn't even just a god in heaven. The most, I almost want to use the word Christology, but it has like a high Romulusology,
Yeah. Yeah.
where in the version in Plutarch, he has slightly changed the earlier version. So there's the story of after Romulus is killed and disappears, and then there's like this translation tale. A high senator is going down one of the most famous famous roads in Italy, and he basically comes along a brilliant and shining Romulus who tells them that I'm this god in heaven, and should basically worship me and follow my instructions and become a great empire. This story is very old, but the version that Plutarch gives us in the 2nd century, he adds a little bit to it, who says, I was a god who was descended from heaven and came down. So basically, now Romulus has pre-existence as one of his
Right.
features.
Right.
So you could say it's like, okay, so started off as a legendary dude who founded a city, dude who becomes a god or gets deified into a god, to pre-existent entity who came down from heaven to found an empire and then returned to heaven after completing his mission.
Which is okay, and this is where you can start looking at historical precedents for people, and even deities evolving in terms of their explanation of where they've come from and who they are, etc., etc. And you can look at that in terms of, Yahweh or Jesus and Christian God and so on. And it would be possibly special pleading to say that actually that kind of God wouldn't go through these kind of evolutionary pressures, if you like. Let's
Yeah.
just, before you go on, Reverend Tacos Entertainment Channel says, do you have any proof that those men called themselves God? So we're probably thinking about the emperors and generals and whatnot, or that came after them, and they were appointed as God as a title. So is there any evidence of these people calling themselves gods?
Um, so,
That's how
for
I
example,
understand
the
that.
pharaohs were supposed to be gods on Earth, and that in the Egyptian system, and the entire like myth of Isis and Osiris and the birth of Horus was supposed to basically legitimate those sorts of claims. Um, for the most part, like most of the Roman emperors would only be deified after their deaths, and if they basically got the acclaim of the Roman people. So, for example, Caligula didn't get that sort of reverence because people saw him as an indulgent kind of crazy dude. So he didn't get great acclamation. But Tiberius did, Augustus did, Julius Caesar did. Um, how much they were calling themselves gods while on Earth, that seems to be less common. Like, from what I could tell, most of the literature about Augustus would say he was the son of a god, but not necessarily a god on Earth right now, except for maybe like a demigod like Heracles was.
Fair enough. And going on to talk about those other gods in antiquity, were there any other clear examples of some of these gods, or any gods in the Greek pantheon, being dependent or being concocted out of real historical people?
It really seems to have been a modern, and when I say modern, I mean modern for the Greeks' invention, that
Right.
you can follow, like the stories of Zeus, as well as, this thunder god seems to have a lot of affinity with Hittite mythology, for example. And the Hittites also spoke Indo-European, so there's also less of a cultural gap between Greek and Hittite. And also, the Hittites were in control of a region that would be the likely place of the Trojan War, among other things. There was lots of trade and things like that. So there's not really too much to say that the main Greek gods had that sort of prehistory that is demonstrable. Now, if we want to turn it to our friend, well, your friend, my friend, Adonai,
Right.
or in the tetragram Yahweh, was he, that interesting speculation that kind of started the churning thought process. Is there any reason to believe that this was originally just some like tribal guy who just was so reverently treated? I mean, we don't really know that well of where Yahwism came from, but the one of the tangents that I'm aware of that might suggest the name is that there was a region in basically like the Arabian desert called Yah, and it's plausible that Yah was the local deity for that region, and so Yahweh is more of a region-specific name rather than a
Right.
personal name.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then that would be more likely not due to a person, but just general development of deities from local places.
That's an interesting concept in itself, that a god can be something that doesn't just evolve out of a historical person, but it kind of comes from a geographical place, just
Yeah,
almost a representation of an area in some kind of a deification of geography. Yeah.
yeah. And far more often than not, when I see Euhemerized stories, at least when the Christians got their hands on the theory itself, they used that to try to say, well, only our God exists. All the other ones have to be fake. So they used the theories of Euhemerus to basically say, oh, you guys are just worshiping a bunch of dead men. It even gets a bit fun when you get to Norse mythology. So in the stories from
Yeah. So
the
Odin.
yeah. So like there's like there are like two versions of the Eddas. There's the poetic Eddas and the prose Eddas. The poetic is considered older and a little bit closer to what the original form was, and the prose Edda, as the name suggested, wasn't in poet form. And this was the one that gets more meddled by Christians. And in the prose version, all of the Norse gods, they're actually survivors of the Trojan War. They're all just heroes from there who then
Wow,
escaped and then did all their things up north. So
interesting.
yeah, and there might be some evidence that the Christians might have done that with like some of the Irish deities and turned them into saints. There's a little bit of evidence for that.
A sort of syncretism there going on, as they're taking on elements of other religions to pull into their own to kind of maybe I never know whether that's then that kind of idea is something that's calculated or just happens because and it becomes useful, whether someone sits there and goes, right, if we take these ideas and pull that into our religion, then we're going to be able to have control and
Mm.
some purchase with these cultures that we're trying to proselytize to. Whether it's that calculator or it just kind of happens organically, I don't know.
Yeah, it's
um
probably a little mixture of both in the same way when Christian missionaries go to a place and they hear the locals have some kind of sort of flood story, and then that then gets used to say, oh, they're going to take that story of yours, modify a little bit so it sounds a little bit closer to the biblical version, and say this is, evidence, of course, that the Bible story is everywhere. It's just, misunderstood by these local
yeah,
folks.
of course. It's an interesting question here. I don't know if you have the expertise and knowledge about North Korea here, but would Kim Il Sung be a modern example of a creation of a god, since he is seen as an eternal god in North Korea? And again, this kind of idea goes back to the question I asked before: is do the people ever actually believe that someone like this was actually divine, whether it's just some kind of thing they do?
Yeah, I certainly don't know what the average North Korean thinks about these things, especially since the society is so closed off. It's really hard to go and do a good survey there. I don't know so well about Kim Il Sung, but his son Kim Jong Il, um, he basically had all sorts of stories of like like double rainbows at his birth and a new star in the sky and things like that. Um, I think they even said that he doesn't shit. I think they also alleged that that these the Il family is just so. Sorry, the Kim family is so pure they don't even need to defecate. How much does the average North Korean believe that? I have no idea, though. But they basically have created the literature to suggest that they are effectively deities in an atheistic country.
Yeah, which is itself a properly interesting idea, right?
Well, I mean, the same thing. You go to Moscow, and they still have the body of Lenin there and preserved, so that way he's basically like a modern version of the cult of the saints, but a communist saint.
Yeah. Wow, interesting. What else? I mean, did you write an article on this, on euhemerization?
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of background history to this. I was originally interested to see how applicable the idea was to some of the Christian storytelling, especially because of the way Richard Carrier was using it in his book about Jesus mythicism. So in some ways, kind of the opposite of what you were suggesting of like Jesus was originally a dude and just basically was elevated all the way to equality with God and identity with Yahweh. Um, the idea of like the mythicist approach there was that Jesus was originally some sort of deity, but then stories were told to make him a dude on Earth. And so the question I wanted to see was, to what degree this flexibility was even allowed there. So I was exploring how Euhemerism worked or didn't work in that time, and I created a presentation that I presented at the Society of Biblical Literature back in 2016, which was too many years ago. I had a little less white in my beard then. And I'm currently rewriting an article to actually publish and submit to try to say, well, first to describe the theory and also fix some problems, because there's only like a couple papers about Euhemerism in New Testament studies literature, and they kind of mess up what Euhemerism is because it gets confused with deification or apotheosis. The idea that in Euhemerism, you take an original story of a god and force them into history. With deification, you take an historical figure and promote them to godhood. So one is kind of like the reverse of the other. And the Christian, or I shouldn't say the Christian literature, but the New Testament literature kind of mixed that up. So I'm not the only person to have noticed this. Another classicist had already written, who's basically an expert on Euhemerism, has written like books and articles about it. So everything I say should be like what few things I say about Euhemerism is less than what other classicists have forgotten about
Sure.
Euhemerism. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to say, okay, here's what it actually is. Here's how it functioned, and here how it could be used both to attack a theistic belief or to even promote a theistic belief. Because a lot of these Euhemeristic stories back then were knowingly crafted to create an exoteric tale, but esoterically, it had some other interpretation or meaning to it. I particularly try to show that that seems to be behind some of the storytelling of Isis and Osiris, who were originally Egyptian deities, very clearly Egyptian deities in all the way back to the Old Kingdom in the inscriptions we have. But in the story that Plutarch gives us, Isis and Osiris are originally the first king and queen of Egypt, basically, and they were people that went around and did amazing deeds, and of course Osiris getting himself killed, needing to be resurrected, things like that. And the weird thing is also Plutarch says bad things about Euhemerus himself, and yet he presents Euhemeristic stories in several of his writings. So I'm also trying to figure out how do you make sense of this, and seeing like, okay, if basically you're telling these stories to promote some sort of religion, some sort of faith, that's great. But if you're using it to denigrate faith, then you're terrible and you need to get out. That was Plutarch's opinion. So that I could say is like, hey, you can use it to either bring gods low or tell stories about gods in new and interesting ways. And I'm trying to argue this might actually explain some of the stories in the Gospels.
There's an element there of what you're saying of like midrash or pesha, even with like this Hebrew biblical method of retelling stories in other ways to make them more current, and there's a kind of uh, a fluidity to how stories can be used. They aren't just always set in stone as like this is what happened, and this needs to be as I tell you this story, like remember every word I say in the way I say it, right? And now you can tell that to the next person. It has to remain as it is. Actually, stories are told and they adapt because they fulfill needs for the people who are telling the story and for the people who are receiving the story, and then that kind of process goes on, and the story evolves as needs and cultures evolve, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and that both writing and interpreting of tales use the same word in Greek, theologo. So writing these stories or interpreting old stories in certain ways were considered the same sort of process. So it
Interesting.
was, yeah, so like those sorts of reinterpretations were basically baked right into how myth making and storytelling existed back then. You coming up with a new and interesting twist on an idea was acceptable, so long as you had like the right. If your rhetorical goals were consistent with what you could actually get to have happen. If you, well, let's put it this way: if you wanted to go in and speak to people in Palestine and tell them the God creator of the universe was just some Joe Schmo who started a cult to himself, I'm pretty sure you'd have a hard time convincing people in that environment because of where they're placing them. But on the other hand, if you're in a different environment where this has already become kind of standard practice, like Euhemerus also didn't even invent this idea. Other Euhemeristic interpretation of other gods the Greeks had tried to do. So in Herodotus, he talks about the cult to Zalmoxis. And Zalmoxis was a god to people in basically what would be like in modern day Serbia, that kind of region. And the story that Herodotus provides is saying, well, they worship him as a god, but really it was just some dude who started a cult to himself and got himself killed and said he was going to come back after 3 years of being buried, but that never really happened. And now people go and visit this god by taking messengers and like staking them to death so they can go to the underworld and come back with a message. Basically, Herodotus took this story about the god Zalmoxis and just turned it into or at least his source turned it into a story about a dude to try to denigrate their religion.
So it's interesting, and this is why you end up with stories about gods that are so different, right? Different accounts of even the same kind of thing that they did, the same story about that god, some task they did or whatever, and there are
Yeah.
different versions of that story. I don't want to put you on a spot, but can you think of any situations where there are two completely different stories of the same god doing the same, supposedly the same thing, but with very different details?
Oh yeah, actually in the creation account in the Theogony of Hesiod, He basically gives the story of humanity twice and basically says, and here's another version. It's like, I'm just going to come out and say, here's two different versions. I know they're not the same, and I don't care. Enjoy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's actually even more clear about the fact these are two different stories than the editors of Genesis were, where you have the two creation stories, right next to each other, and unless you're a diehard young Earth creationist and cannot accept that these stories contradict because they're from different sources, everyone else can read the Theogony and say, oh, there's two different accounts of the creation of humanity. Okay, we don't know necessarily why there'd be two accounts, but Hesiod saw no problem just putting them right next to each other and just basically saying, which one do you like more?
Yeah, I'm only going to include this comment because someone's mentioned Star Trek and it might get you a bit excited. Being a science fiction buff, I think Superman is God, although he never declared himself God. Much like Q in Star Trek, Q seems to have the powers of God, but it's never stated what Q is. I have no idea what he's talking about, Aaron.
Okay, so Q was a character introduced in the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and basically, Q is not only very godlike in his powers, that literally he can snap his fingers and anything can happen. He has like a seeming omnipotence and he can go anywhere in space and time. He can send the Enterprise to any part of the galaxy he wishes, and so on. But he's also played up like a trickster. He's like there to test people. Basically, Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, wrote the character Q to be like his vision of like what Yahweh is just this terrible, overly pompous, brutish god that going around and just messing with humanity. Uh, and of course, in the very first episode, he's
Sorry,
coming in trying to mess with the Enterprise.
I just want you to clarify. Did you say British God or Brutish God?
Brutish.
Yeah, because I think British would be much better. The top hat and the monocle go, well, verily, I'm going to send the Star Trek here. I'm going to send
Well,
the USS Enterprise here.
well, let's put it this way. For all of Q's faults, he never colonized anyone.
Ooh, ouch. um, right, fair
Yeah.
enough.
But to continue the question, if you could pop it back
Please
up.
do.
So I forget the exact part of the question. Yeah, Superman being a god. Well, his name is Kal-El. And El being the old Hebrew word for God, and that was on purpose from the creators of Superman, who were a couple of Jewish boys from Brooklyn. So I think, they purposely chose those sorts of things. But it depends on where you want to put the definition of God, because the thing is, what a god is changes. It's kind of what you want to call a god. I mean,
It's a
even
really good
in
point, actually, and it's something we probably don't think about enough. Is actually what defines a god.
yeah, well,
And then
like
you get demigod, which is like, well, that's a bit like God, but not quite the full God.
yeah, well, like for example, like the idea of monotheism is actually much more modern than we think. In particular, if you're familiar with Dan McClellan.
No, not hugely. I come across him, yeah, mentioned quite a
Okay,
lot.
well, he's probably like the biggest TikTok star when it comes to biblical studies.
Yeah.
But he's also like written a fair bit, and he's going to be putting on a conference about how monotheism is basically a modern invention, and like even when the word monotheism itself was created, it still didn't have the meaning that we're giving it now. Of there is only one God in all of existence.
Yeah,
But
because for those who don't know, there's monolatry or henotheism, which is like the understanding that there are lots of gods, and this is arguably what was going on in the Hebrew Bible. And when you talk about the Council of Gods, and you talk about the idea that Yahweh has taken on all these stories from other gods, in this kind of intertextual situation where all these other holy books and cultures around, and those stories are getting sort of brought in, syncretized, some might say,
yeah,
into the Hebrew Bible. But the idea is that they're saying, okay, there are lots of gods, but this is the supreme God. This is like your number one cool God.
yeah.
It's not denying the existence of the other gods, but it's just saying that our one's bigger and better than all of your ones, type thing. And that's yeah. So that's often what was going on, rather than, as you say, strict monotheism.
Yeah, and to show how weird that can be. So when we say monotheism, we're automatically probably thinking Judaism, Christianity, Islam. If you go back to the time of the first century and you're reading the works of Philo of Alexandria, who basically would have been a contemporary of Jesus in that historical period.
He was a
And
Jewish sort of writer and philosopher and whatnot.
yeah, yeah. Um, and we happen to have a lot of his literature because the Christians were like, "Ooh, this looks good," and we'll keep that because he also uses words like the logos a lot and things like that. And you can almost see like if the Gospel of John wasn't reading Philo, he knew that kind of theology and is adapting it into. In the beginning was the logos, in the beginning was the word, sort of intro to his stuff. But in Philo, while he obviously thinks very highly of Yahweh, God of the universe. And he tries saying, well, like, there's these other powers in heaven, but are they actually separate gods, or are they just some sort of like emanations of the Almighty God? There's things like that there. But even so, like when he talks like just straight up astronomy, he refers to the planets as theoi, as gods. And this was even at a time when most astronomers would have actually said the planets are not actually gods. They're physical objects that undergo motions due to mechanical laws. They had some ideas of like a mechanical universe, and that's how things went. Not that they were pushed by angels, as some later Christians would suggest. But nonetheless, the fact that Philo, a monotheistic Jew, allegedly, says the planets are gods, he uses the word gods for those objects, just shows how flexible the term could be, even within an allegedly monotheistic context.
Well, if we're going to go down that rabbit hole, I mean, the Elephantine letters were interesting. These letters from, the outposts of the kind of Jewish area. We had this, what we can find out from reading those is that actually they had a really, again, kind of syncretistic understanding of Judaism. That Judaism wasn't this very singular orthodox religion, and the Hebrew Bible wasn't this one thing, because arguably it wasn't put together at that stage. And so when we look back from our position now in history and geography, you think that, that's what they believed all through that time, but actually it was a whole mix of what people believed, and there were a bunch of different sort of deities that were believed in, as well as the Yahweh beliefs, so on and so forth.
When we find in the older inscriptions that Yahweh had a sex partner named Asherah, and we have inscriptions and pictures of the two of them together, and descriptions that seem to suggest that also the God of the universe was really packing it when it came to what was between his legs, as described in that book I see on your shelf back there by Francisca Stavakafakulu. Yes, the God and Anatomy book. I feel bad. I only read it as an audiobook. I need to get it for just the pictures. But yeah, the fact that, the idea that there's only one God running the whole universe was itself a later innovation within Judaism, and probably also in part inspired by other religions. Like, well, the Greeks themselves were moving towards some form of henotheism, that they were basically treating Zeus as not just a really powerful god, but basically the god, like the most worthy of worship, and all the other ones are basically, supposed to get in line and follow his dictates. So there's some of that going on. In Zoroastrianism, you basically have two deities, the one of like goodness and the one of evil or darkness, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, and they're of equal power. So those were, some of the inspirations we know that Judaism was interacting with, whether during the exilic period when the Jews were, at least the Jewish elite were taken to Babylon, then eventually the Babylonians taken over by the Persians, and the Persians saying, okay, you can go back and rebuild your temple, here's some funding. And of course, doing that funding while still under the thumb of Persian influence. So it's like, yeah, you can go back to your home country, we just happen to own the country too. There's lots of wonderful, plausible influences, so there was never any one kind of Yahwism, and not even one kind of Yahwism in the Bible.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah. So going back to Euhemerism, I mean, you've talked a little bit. I don't know if you had where you wanted to go exactly, but you mentioned how it can be used to denigrate any given religious belief, and it can be used to gain extra understanding or support that belief. So talk to us a little bit about these two approaches.
Yeah, so when it comes to the denigrating approach, like, for example, what the Christians would do with the theory to say that you pagans, you're just worshiping dead men, we are worshiping the living God. That was like the kind of rhetoric they produced. And they used Euhemeris's thinking or theory to do that. And I should say thinking because evidence suggests that almost nobody was reading Euhemeris. They just knew
Right.
of that kind of idea in the same sort of way you could never watch Star Wars, but everyone knows what the Force is. That's kind of like how popular the idea was that it could float around without even having to read it. Um, so the Christians, have that idea, and they're using that to basically go in and say, all these gods that you worship, they're all false. They're just glorified men, while we worship the true God, the true creator of the universe, who died and then conquered death. That's their rhetoric, and to some degree, the Greeks might have been doing that to other gods. One interesting example I can also remember, where they kind of retell the story of the creation in the Babylonian mythos. So, where Marduk is supposed to defeat Tiamat, divide him up, and create the world from that way. The Greeks have a version where the king Belus was the first to found the city of his name, Babylon. And Belus actually comes from Baal. The Is that Ugaritic? I forget, but a word that means Lord in, I forget which language, if it's Ugaritic or another Semitic language. I need to triple check that. But nonetheless, and then when he says that Belus created Babylon, he took a place that was called sea and divided up into quarters, and that dividing of the sea was the creation account when like Tiamat was torn apart to separate the waters above and below, and the same thing in the Genesis account, the separation of waters. That separation of waters was just the dividing of this territory called sea to found the city of Babylon. So you get this interesting rationalization or reinterpretation of the Babylonian creation myth to make it much more mundane by comparison. And also, they try to give some historical pedigree to this. They literally put this in the mouth of Nebuchadnezzar. It allegedly says this was a speech given by Nebuchadnezzar, like in his last few years of rulership. Also, yeah, these fake accounts put into fake quotes. It's fiction on top of fiction. It's really wonderful in that way. But the converse of using that to actually promote religion.
And of course,
So
sorry, just to add to what you were saying there. Of course, when you're doing skeptical, critical exegesis of, say, again, to refer to the resurrection, historical, a critical examination of the Easter story, or the nativity, a critical examination. These kind of projects are a case of looking at Jesus in this case and saying, this person, right, we need to explain, if I don't believe that Jesus exists as a deity, I need to explain how people came to worship this guy. So how do we
yeah,
understand that in terms of like, you get someone like Richard Carrier who says, well, actually it was just made up of whole cloth, taken from these different ideas here and there, and poof, you've got this deity suddenly existing. Whereas I would say, as a historicist, although I'm not so dogmatic, died in a wall, but I would say there was a historical person that existed, some kind of itinerant preacher. He ended up getting crucified, and then his believers went through sort of cognitive dissonance reduction, or and time passed, and he got, his story got embellished, and they weren't expecting him to die, but he ended up being crucified, and that's kind of weird. So how do we explain this guy dying, our Messiah dying, and then going back through the Hebrew Bible and concocting this kind of story and understanding and theology of this person, and out of that you get this deification that takes place. Whether I wouldn't have actually, I don't think they thought he was a deity at the time. It depends again how you define deity. I think that most of his followers would have thought he was a Messiah. And then it was only sort of later that he got elevated to the full kind of deity, and then out of that you get the issues with the Holy Trinity and so on and so forth. So just to kind of build on what you're saying, skeptical scholars will look at accounts, as we do for many other, possibly many other, religious deities, or some other religious deities. We just apply that in this case to Jesus and say that this is euhemerization, really.
yeah. Oh, and before I forget, I wanted to give you an example of someone using euhemerization to promote or maybe even disguise the beliefs or somehow promote it. So the two examples I have explored the most, the one related to the Isis and Osiris cult, because a euhemerized version of that exists in Plutarch. And Plutarch says, well, it shows the stories of Isis and Osiris being this king and queen going around Egypt and doing things. But he says what the real story is about is actually about what the actual demigods are doing, and the benefits that they bring to humanity and what they did to basically achieve true godhood. And that's only symbolically told in this tale that he tells earlier in his story. So that's one example. And more recently, I stumbled across another source doing something similar. And it's in a more magical tradition. So the god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, Mercury for the Latins, Hermes for the Greeks, there was an amalgamation of Hermes with a similar messenger writing god in Egypt, usually pronounced, I usually hear pronounced as Thoth. So Hermes and Thoth kind of get syncretized together when the Egyptians and Greeks are like interacting more directly. And in the Greco-Roman period, this character is created known as Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. And this person is supposed to be like the source of like not just writing but also like magical traditions. So like there's stuff like called the Hermetic literature, which is like for magical spells, incantations, alchemy, things like that. And most of the stories will have Hermes as a scribe to like the first Egyptian pharaoh who preserved all of his knowledge and inscribed it before like a great flood came in, destroyed everything, and the rediscovery of all that is like where all like knowledge of magic come from because of the early work of Hermes. Or so the story goes. In other sources, they just straight out say, Hermes, our god that we pray to for our incantation to work. So in the exoteric stories, the ones that is kind of like more promoted and more well known, especially in our Christian sources, Hermes is a dude. But internally, to the actual people like performing Hermetic magic, Hermes is a god. And they understand that basically, like one of the later Neoplatonists basically says people are getting like visions or revelations from Hermes and then attribute it, or they attribute it to Hermes to give it authority. And so by saying, this vision I had actually goes back to the historical Hermes, it's a way of like giving more gravitas to that thing that you basically dreamed up one night, honestly.
Absolutely. Mitch, good old Mitch. Thanks for popping by, Mitch, by the way. He's a bit of a legend. Although, actually, not really. He's a real human that exists in reality. I'm wondering if, although maybe I can deify Mitch, that'd be wonderful. Mitch Mazarola says, I'm wondering if Euhemerism can be properly described as post hoc deification. Well, yes, I think in some cases, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the two are definitely related. Though again, it kind of depends on in which direction things were going. Was there originally a person, and then they get advanced to deity, or was there a deity, and then the stories of that is put into human history? So, if most likely Zeus was always a god, but then stories were created that made him a person, that's going in the direction of euhemerization.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
deification would be like the Caesars doing Caesary things and then getting declared gods upon their death.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification, because that is quite important, and you have talked us through that, but that summarizes it pretty well. So where else have you gone in the paper that you've written?
Yeah, so the main thing I try to do besides, setting up like the theoretical groundwork for what euhemerism is, what its functions are, and how to potentially detect it. So it's more evidence-based rather than just, well, doing what everyone else did and just imagine this is where the stories came from. Like, how would you actually prove that you have euhemerism? The main criteria, among others, was that you have an older version of the story that's clearly mythological or cosmic, and then a later version where it's historical. And then you would look like, okay, this looks like it's the direction things have gone. You start with something happening in a basically either timeless or supernatural context, and then a later version with some telltale signs that the two versions know each other. And if that later version is, in a historical setting, that's probably a case of euhemerization. So, like what Euhemerus did with Zeus, Zeus is originally a sky god, but then he's turned into a regular human who, founds cities and creates laws and things like that. That's an example of euhemerization. Now, once I do that, I say, okay, and now let's see, can we show that there are any examples of that in the gospel stories of Jesus? And I argue something that I had in my head when I was writing this book.
Hey.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this idea back when I wrote my book on the Star of Bethlehem, but I did not have anywhere near the evidence or theoretical backing to investigate it deeply. And also, I didn't want to have like a whole side thing that I felt like I couldn't prove that would distract from the main point of the book, which is if you try to use astronomy to find the Star of Bethlehem, you're just going to drive yourself mad going in circles. It's definitely not historical, it's definitely fiction. But my other question is, did the fiction come from an earlier story, which itself was even more fantastical? Because there are other stories or statements that Jesus didn't just simply have a star at his birth, but literally Jesus is a star, and he became a star upon his resurrection. That is probably most clearly seen in what's called the Star Hymn in the letter of Ignatius of Antioch. In the letter he sent to the Ephesians, there's this little hymn in there that seems to be suggesting when Jesus died and was rising in the heavens, he was rising as this super brilliant star where all the other stars and other entities in the sky were all like singing and dancing in chorus to this new entity in the heavens. And, well, that's kind of interesting. Jesus is a star. There was a star at his birth. Is there some sort of connection? And I try spending some time doing some source criticism to say it looks like there are these other accounts that are independent of each other, but have some sort of common source suggesting Jesus was a star. And this idea itself of basically some sort of almost messianic figure coming down from heaven as a stellar deity or becoming a stellar deity was even pre-Christian. There's actually that idea I can find in Philo and things like that. And this title that Jesus has, that Jesus is the morning star, that basically no one has a good explanation for. That's what I'm trying to argue, that I can, one, figure out where this title of Jesus comes from and say that this is an earlier mythical view of Jesus and then gets historicized into the Star of Bethlehem account in the Gospel of Matthew.
Interesting. Ah, is this to say you're doing original scholarship there?
Yes.
Awesome. And that's so rare these days because everyone's written everything already. So not evidently not everyone. So, interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So, and the weird thing is that in like the commentaries on Ignatius of Antioch, they'll look at that Star Hymn account and say, "Oh, this is about the birth of Jesus," even though like the context is Jesus is the star, Jesus is in heaven, and even the story itself says this can't be about the birth of Jesus because in the intro to that hymn, it says the things that were hidden from the devil were like the virginity of Mary and Jesus' birth and his passion, that these were all supposed to have been hidden from the devil. And so you can't imagine, well, at his birth, there was all the heavens singing and dancing all at once. That's not a way of doing something, as Ignatius put it, in silence. If all of heaven is singing, that ain't silent. So it's like, okay, this doesn't seem to be reconcilable. And yet in those same commentaries will say, well, this star hymn, it's about the star at Jesus' birth, but it goes back to an older myth. And it's like, well, you can't just leave that on the floor and just walk past that. So I feel like there are breadcrumbs that other scholars have maybe kind of sort of seen, but not known how to put together. And by using the theory of Euhemeris and also some of my own source critical work, suggesting an older star myth for our friend Jesus.
So this is not really connected particularly to what we're saying, but it's a really interesting question. So how did Jesus get so well known without Twitter and YouTube? Were there no other big manipulators? I mean, just the whole idea of how you get to a big religion without like social media, I think that's a really interesting question. Now, this is sometimes used as a kind of argument to William Lane Craig's done this before, say like the increase in number of adherents to Christianity is itself prima facie evidence of its truth. Yeah. And that's what he kind of argues, that if it wasn't true and it was kind of Jesus didn't exist, was either like entirely mythological or a historical person, then that's much harder to get to, Christianity taking over that that area geographically as it did in the time frame that it did. And he talks about the first 30 years and so on and so forth. But the
Yeah.
problem is that he's completely disproven with the analysis of Mormonism, of LDS, Church of Latter-day Saints, and so on and so forth, where you have a growth in these belief systems that is just massive in timeframes that were much quicker than with Jesus, although you can argue that there was technology. So a really interesting book is Jesus Before the Gospels by Bart Ehrman that talks about like, how did the Gospels get created. But there's a lot of storytelling going on amongst communities. I guess these days we don't have communities. We do everything technologically now, and it's all about sitting down and watching TV and just tech and staring at our screens and whatnot, as you guys are doing right now, right? But I guess in the time around Jesus, there's just going to be a lot more people talking to other people, communities, people traveling and swapping ideas and stories, and these things just spread, like that. Do you have anything to say to this question or idea?
Yeah, it is worth noting that religions could also spread and get popular even if there are significant authorities against it. So, for example, when the cult of Dionysus was like first coming to the Roman Republic, it was actually initially repressed, in part because like, hey, we can't just have a cult that basically has our women going off and getting crazy drunk and doing weird things in the forest. But nonetheless, it became a super popular religion despite that. Stories that are not true or just have the most tiny inkling of any connection to history can become widely known. And it doesn't require the supernatural. Otherwise, you'd have to believe, for example, during the, not the Peloponnesian War, the, one of the wars between Rome and the Carthaginians. I'm forgetting the name all of a sudden for those wars. It'll come to me later. But one of the things the Romans were supposedly told by one of their prophetesses that if you really, want to win and protect yourself, you need to go and import the
Punic
religion.
Wars.
Sorry? The Punic
Wars.
The Punic Wars. Yeah, I believe it was during the Second Punic Wars that the Romans were told by one of the Sibyls that they need to go and bring this artifact, this stone from Anatolia that is supposed to be of important worship to the cult of Cybele there, and bring that to Rome to bring that protection to there. And since the Romans eventually won the Second Punic War, I guess that's true, and we should all be worshippers of Cybele. But I don't see too many Cybele apologists arguing that today.
Well, we're going right off the topic of Euhemerism here, but it kind of links to the idea that I always talk about with regard to the 10 plagues of Egypt, and the idea that if you're going to have a god coming down and giving 10 plagues to a country that's killing, the firstborn and the cattle and all these terrible things, and then the Pharaoh says no, and then God hardens his heart, and then X, Y, and Z, and all this stuff happens, and you've got pillars of fire or whatever, all this crazy stuff going on, and then as soon as that's over, like everyone in Egypt goes, well, that was fun, wasn't it? Right, let's get on with believing what we were believing just before that all happened. It's like, you don't hear about Yahweh and Judaism until like 1,500 years later.
Yeah, it's not like the Cathars for the Osiris cult suddenly dried up after all that, because everyone realized, oh, the real power was here, and he completely turned the Nile to blood. And it's like, the flooding of the Nile is supposed to literally be like the resurrection of Osiris, and they went right back to that, even though the river was like changed to blood at the command of one of their enslaved populations. It's like, you should have changed your theology just a tad, just a touch.
It's just, and it's just like that is so prima facie, so much prima facie evidence to me that the whole Exodus account didn't take place. It's just the fact that no one changed their belief system at all, even though they were massively shown. I mean, that Yahweh talks about this, is about showing his strength, right? And it's like, this is how majorly impressive I am. Yeah. And then everyone's like, "Whoa, my God, that's terrible." Anyway,
well, it must have been pretty forgettable, because the Jews leaving in the Exodus themselves, they seem to almost instantly fall back into pagan or non Yahweh worship almost instantly. It's like you were just saved with all these miracle things, and like 5 minutes in, it's like, I really want a golden idol again. Ah, jeez. It's like, come on. It's fiction on top of nonsense.
Yeah, agreed. Anyway, sorry for that sidebar. So as we kind of start meandering towards the end and wrapping this up, what else do you have to say about Euhemerism? Probably lots.
Yeah, well, of course, what I need to do is, get this thing published and have some experts tell me what's what. But I will note that when I actually first presented this idea back in 2016 at the Society of Biblical Literature, there were a couple of big names in the audience that day. One of them was Hector Avalos, but
Sadly passed away.
yeah, and if I had known better, I would have understand better because when he was at that talk, um, he had fallen asleep. But now I know, of course, with his health issues, I always realized if I could have done, if what I was saying was helping him rest, then I feel better having done that. If I was boring enough to help him get some sleep, that's great. Um, the other person who was in the audience and asked a question during Q&A was Bart Ehrman.
Ah, interesting.
And I did not completely shit my pants in answering his question. So I feel like I have some reason to be proud of not completely screwing up. Did I, convince him about the wonders and truths of Euhemerism? Probably not. I'll, need to get the article out there and see what he thinks then. But at the very least, he seemed engaged enough to think, okay, I'm not insane, just maybe not yet enough to, change his paradigm. In the future, we'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, I need to get that sort of stuff published and see how much the field could actually use this in advance and solve, in some ways, certain problems within New Testament studies. So you mentioned, a couple books by Bart Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels, and also How Jesus Became God is a good one that I've
It's
been
brilliant,
using.
brilliant book.
Yeah,
That's just behind that top blue one. There
yeah,
is that beige that's just there. Is How Jesus Became God, and I think it
yeah.
is a really good book.
Yeah,
Really.
and he actually shows that, like, even in the days of Paul, let alone to the gospel period, there are basically like two Christologies existing at the same time where
Yeah.
Jesus was an awesome dude and Jesus was literally a supernatural deity of some sort from heaven descended to earth. That you basically
Yes.
had the pre-existent incarnation theology versus the apotheosis theology. As you can tell, I need more beer to drink this say this properly. So the fact that you have both of these theologies in the same time, and Ehrman doesn't actually even do himself full service because he basically says Paul has, like, in this part of Romans, he has a more apotheosis theology, and here he has an incarnation Christology. It's like Paul believes both at the same time. That needs some reconciliation. How are we going to make sense of this? And if what I'm suggesting about Euhemerism is true, then it might explain why the Gospels depict Jesus as a dude. They already believe maybe the really high Christology that you find things in, like the Philippians hymn, where Jesus is like some high entity who descends, takes on flesh, gets killed, and then returns to heaven in an even more glorious state. If say the Gospel of Mark believed that sort of thing, but is using Euhemerism to tell his story in the same way the Hermeticists told stories of Hermes as a scribe to justify and tell stories of their own, religious beliefs. Could that be what Mark is doing? And so we can't take the surface level of Jesus is called the Son of God only at his baptism, for example. This could help reconcile these contradictions in Christology. And there's been arguments about what the correct Christology is of the early Christians for like a century, and I might be able to at least help that argument.
Interesting. Oh my goodness. Are there any questions anyone has in the live chat? Want to ask to Aaron about anything to do with Euhemerism or anything that we've talked about today? And while people might be thinking about things they want to ask you, is there anything else about this topic that needs to be said, do you think?
Well, we can also note that in many ways this kind of fits our own thoughts about how religions come about, where we're trying to come up with their own rationalizations. And this is something even biblical studies went through when they tried saying all the miraculous things that Jesus did. These were just, ignorant sheep herders misunderstanding what's actually going on or things getting exaggerated. So, for example, Jesus walking on water. Well, Jesus didn't actually walk on water. What really happened was it was a dark and stormy night, and when the disciples were in their ship and being thrown about on the Sea of Galilee, they didn't realize that they actually had landed ashore and were actually beached. So when Jesus was walking to them on the beach shore, they thought they were out in the middle of the lake, and they thought Jesus was walking on water. This is actually something in old biblical studies to try to explain that sort of story. And you could say that that's not likely. It might be more likely than actually walking on water, but maybe
Well,
that's
this
just
is,
modern
yeah.
mythology.
This is where we get into the long grass of sort of Bayesian probability analysis
Mm-hmm.
of and I did this with my resurrection book again to mention that is that whatever naturalistic explanation you have for the data for the stories is already more plausible than a divine. So
Yeah.
as implausible as what you said might be, it's still more plausible than a god man spirit walking on water in the context of that, like, literal understanding of that.
Yeah, yeah. While it might be absolutely crazy to say that Jesus was walking on water because an alien spaceship was using a tractor beam to hold him up, that sounds completely crazy, but that's at least consistent with the laws of physics versus God basically, like, what, bringing his hand down and holding him up to, like, keep him on the surface of the water. It's like, one is not uh the theistic one is not better than the alien one, and the alien one is at least consistent with the laws of physics.
It gets onto like supernaturalism. If you, in your background knowledge of how the world works, accept that supernaturalism is fine and that
Yeah.
that stuff can happen, then that's going to affect the way that you calculate your probabilities. But that's a whole other, I guess, story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to say?
Uh, as we go and tell stories, we need to make sure that we're not making modern myths.
What do you mean?
Uh, it's very easy to speculate about these things in the past or come up with just so stories, as is said, like the just so that Jesus wasn't actually walking water; it was just the disciples got confused. These are just so stories to save face. If we want to know what really is going on, we need a better technique than sitting in our armchairs and just thinking, well, people back then were just so stupid that just without evidence, we can just disparage them and come up with other things. Where we can actually see things were confused and changed, we need good evidence for. So, for example, one of the books I have on my shelf here, The First Fossil Hunters, and arguing that, like, the discoveries of dinosaur bones actually help lead to the myths of, like, the Cyclops and other creatures like that. And the way we can actually know that is we can actually say, here's a dinosaur bone that they were worshiping, and we have, like, the documentation for it, and we can see, or it's a dinosaur bone, or it's an elephant bone, or things like that. And you realize, oh, this is where these stories come from, but only because we got a shed load of evidence to prove that, rather than just, I wonder if they were just really confused by everything they saw.
Well,
That
that's
is
really
how we
interesting
avoid making modern stories.
because you're talking about a kind of version of the euhemerization, this deification version, rather than the other direction you've been
Mm-hmm.
talking about. But the idea of creating a myth out of a reality, talk to us a little bit as your parting gift to us in
Ah,
terms of teaching us about mythology and the evolution of myth. Talk to us about the skull, the elephant skull, and
mm.
Cyclops, and that story.
So we actually talk a little bit about that in this book here.
What? What in this book?
Yeah, in this book, I bring up the origins of the Cyclops is very plausibly due to people actually finding elephant skulls. And as you probably would guess, hey, elephants aren't that common in modern day Europe, and there are skeletons though of more ancient elephants and smaller elephants around Greece and other places like that. And if you look at these old skulls, where the trunk was, where there's that giant hole for the trunk, it would look like if this were a person's skull, that's where, like, a giant eye would be. And there's some evidence that actually skulls like that were found and called, like, monsters of the past in Greco-Roman literature. So the story of the Cyclops is at least partially inspired, if not completely, the result of finding old elephant bones. So it is the case that in some cases, people can find these old things and create stories to them. But on the other hand, we also have to make sure that we moderns aren't just finding these old stories and also creating our own myths for how these stories were created. And also to connect it to this book, again, this is basically what they do on the show Ancient Aliens every single effing episode, where it's like, well, these stories are so weird. They must have misinterpreted aliens coming down. It's like, yeah, you're just making up stories and denigrating these people and where these stories actually come from to basically feed into your 1950s fantasy of how the universe operates. Because, well, we've been looking for the UFOs for a while and it's not coming out so well. And the stuff from Eric von Daniken and the like, it's very interesting and imaginative, but that's what it is, imaginative, not evident.
Well, this is true. This is true. Thank you, Aaron, for introducing us to the idea of Euhemerism. I've really enjoyed our little, you know, jolly through a meander. I don't know. I think we've skipped through the meadows of Euhemerism together, hand in hand, and I for one have enjoyed it. Um, as we have said a couple of times, Mitch Mazarol in the live chat's talking about it's not in stock. Our book on Amazon at the moment in Canada. He has ordered it, but it's saying it's not yet in stock. Amazon, oh, I hate Amazon, but we absolutely need Amazon. They control all book stuff ever. They are just really difficult when it comes to new books and having their algorithm work out, particularly with smaller publishers and whatnot. So thank you for
Yeah.
ordering it.
Yeah, I do appreciate that, Mitch. But yeah, it is a bit strange that Amazon has all this computing power, but they can't seem to organize books that are just slightly outside of the things they exactly control. It's almost like monopolistic behavior.
I could bore you. I could just sit and talk to you for an hour on how Amazon try and do that to publishers and try and get them to move their business over to Amazon by screwing up the distribution of their competitors. So you move like printing services to Amazon. So oh look, they get, yeah, that's
Oh
Amazon
yeah,
for you.
and it's even not even with books. I've heard similar stories with literally with diapers, where Amazon got into the diaper business and basically suppressed their competitors that were using Amazon for sales, but then Amazon coming in with their own brand of it,
Yeah.
and because they controlled all the marketplace space, they basically pushed out all of their competitors to literally, you know, sell, shit cloth. That's how
Yeah.
much Amazon wants to be. They literally want to control what goes in here and comes out the other end. They want
Yeah.
it all.
And that's what they like. And they're like that with book in the publishing business as well. So that's them screwing stuff over. Jerome says, thanks. Is it an easy book to read? I know we're going off topic here to talk about our recent book, but hey, is it a hard to read book? My memory is currently very bad due to an illness. So you and me both, my friend. It is written for the intelligent layman. There are some appendices that are a bit funky, but the main book itself is relatively easy to read, I think. And that we did write it, hopefully, with it being that kind of book.
I will note, though, that we do also reference a bunch of other arguments that are made by some other author by the name of J.M.S. Pierce about like these 30 arguments against the existence of God. We referred to that one a few times.
That is an easy book to read. I had this ready because I didn't want to outdo our co-author book, but that is an easy book to read, and it's packed full of really like easy digestible arguments. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, 30 arguments against the existence of God, heaven, hell, Satan, and divine design is definitely your bag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will actually note that when it comes to your previous books, there are 5 of them referred in the bibliography. So you might need to get the entire Jonathan Memmis Pierce backlog.
I wouldn't complain. But no, thanks, Aaron. Good stuff. Good fun all. Thank you very much, Weasel. Really appreciate you being on. We'll do this again at some point soon. Aaron and I are on Seth Andrews' Thinking Atheist podcast and video. It'll be coming out in June. We've just had a really great chat with him, so keep your eyes peeled for that when it comes out if you're interested. But what I look forward to reading a published article on Euhemerism soon.
Yeah. Yeah, right now I've shared it with a couple other scholars to give me some feedback before I submit, and I'm also processing another one, the one that's about the origins of the title of Morning Star for Jesus. Once that is through the pipelines, I'm going to try to submit my Euhemerism one because one depends on the other.
Yeah. Nice one. Well, good stuff. Anyway, thanks everyone. Really appreciate you hanging out with us for an hour and a half. You take care. Thank you, Aaron, again. Always good to have a chat, and we'll have a chat, no doubt, next couple of weeks about something. We'll think of something to talk about. But in the meantime, everybody, take care. All the best. And last words to Aaron.
Um, until we meet again.
Brilliant. I was moved. Thanks. Take care, everyone.